Case 623 by Danny Yu. Chapter 53. Later. The soldier, 325570338, Sergeant Barnes James Buchanan, 107th Infantry, U.S. Army, looks down at the notebook in front of him. He will never be the artist that other little boy, Captain Rogers, Stephen Grant, Howling Commandos, SSR, is. But still the imagery cuts him to the core. To the untrained eye, the drawing would be nothing but squiggles, but to Sergeant Barnes, it is a man with two tiny forms in his arms. He doesn't know what it means. He doesn't know why it makes him cry. Tony could feel it going wrong pretty much the moment he and Ross stepped into the conference room. And quite frankly, he didn't get it. Was Ross's ugly face enough to get them all to decide ahead of time that whatever would be said wasn't worth their time? When even Bruce had looked beyond that. Was it that they didn't trust Tony? Or were they all just idiots who hadn't read through a single one of the accord proposals Tony had kept sending them? He got it! Ross was overly confrontational. Tony was going to have to figure out some way to get through to Girl Maximov, if that was still an option. There was the risk that Rogers had already pulled this "you punched the bully, so all's well and good" spiel on her, and Tony wouldn't get through, especially given the fact that Tony and Maximov weren't on the best of terms to begin with. He thought they'd started to communicate, though, at the very least. For a moment there, during Ross's surprisingly sympathetic opening speech, Tony had almost thought he might be able to work around the malicious idiot and still get to them. But then it had all turned around, and what the hell had he even been supposed to do? Quite frankly, Ross's presentation had been impressive, meant to pull on just the right heartstrings to be sympathetic, only to turn it all back on his fucking head with his damn attitude! And all along, Tony was watching the train crash happen, watched Ross flee the Avengers Raw with not a damn thing he could do to stop it, only to then be turned around and watch the most damn provocative salt imaginable be rummed into wounds that the idiot secretary had just opened himself. Tony hated being outmaneuvered, and that was exactly what had happened. Ross had undermined his position simply by pretending to be on his side, and there had not been a thing he could do, not without Bruce here, because he knew Bruce meant what he said when he told him he couldn't be in the same room as Ross without the other guy coming to the fore. Tony wished it could have been different. He wished like hell that he didn't have to deal with Ross, that he could have just stuck the asshole in the deepest, darkest hole he could find, that or just the raft. He didn't have enough dirt on the asshole yet, though, and until Tony was safely under the Accords, the fully ratified Accords that was, there was only so much he could do against his own government. Of course, since this was his life, Aunt Peggy had to go and die in the middle of it all, breaking up all talks and making everything that much more difficult. Worst time she could have chosen to finally start butting in on his life choices. Part of Tony felt disturbingly guilty at sitting at Aunt Peggy's funeral. He didn't know what to do with that feeling. He and his godmother had never been close. Knowing she died didn't make him want to break down in tears. It didn't make his chest clench or his eyes hurt. More than anything, it made him feel a strange emptiness, like remembering a promise that had never been fulfilled. He told himself she wouldn't have cared if he was there. He told himself that she wouldn't have understood why he wasn't, that she would have supported him. He knew Uncle Danny would have. In the end, he told himself it didn't matter either way. He had to do what he had to do, and being there for the ratification of the Accords, for this final shield being raised to guard them from Ross and others of his ilk, this final thing that would finally hold them accountable, roll them into worldwide operations and politics like they always should have been, was more important. He would book a few extra sessions with Dr. Jeff, he decided. That, in the end, was what brought him peace. He hadn't spoken much about Aunt Peggy yet. He was sure Dr. Jeff would have a field day when they did finally get into that. Neither of Tony's parents had been particularly martial, after all. Perhaps Dr. Jeff would decide Tony had lived his entire later life to please his estranged godmother without ever realizing. Psychology would drive him crazy, even as it tried to save him from madness. Romania happened next, and what a crapshoot that was. Even as Tony was wrapping things up back home so we could go to Vienna with things taken care of, the reports trickled in. Cop killing was bad enough in the States on an international level. When it came to internationally deployed police officers doing an officially sanctioned job on an internationally cooperative level, That was almost on the same level as killing someone with diplomatic immunity. And there were 3 of them killed on the spot, 10 more wounded, some of them in critical condition. All Tony could do was watch as more reports trickled in as 2 of those additional police officers died. Angela Merkel was going to be so pissed. And that was without counting the Romanian national disaster. Even Tony's technology couldn't keep track of the people in the collapse of that highway tunnel. 1 minute the report said just 2 dead and a dozen wounded. Another said it was a dozen dead and 100 wounded. Then screw it all. Tony should have done more to prevent this. He should have brought Barnes in, got him the psychiatric care he clearly needed. He could have prevented all this, and he'd been too preoccupied with the soldiers still under Hydra auspices to even lift a finger. He'd failed, more badly than he'd ever failed for as long as he could remember. His inactivity had actively killed so many people, he couldn't even... He shook that off. He couldn't handle that guilt right now. Not that, on top of still needing to do what had to be done. And, Dr. Jeff's voice taunted from the back of his head, while Tony might have been negligent, he was not actively culpable. Rogers, showing up, had messed everything up just as Tony had finished negotiating the kill on sight on Barnes down to a simple capture order without even knowing why he was doing it, aside from the fact that it was the right thing to do. Barnes hadn't blown up anything, after all. Jocasta would have let Tony know if he'd even left Romania. Rogers had killed half those cops and been responsible for arguably all the deaths in that tunnel. Tony might be culpable, but Rogers was actively guilty, and why did he have to take things so far? In the middle of that whole mess, with his head turned all ways but north, Tony very neatly just left Girl Maximoff in the compound with Vision. Vision knew what was happening, knew why Tony had to do what he had to do, but the moment he got off the phone with Jamie and Maria and an attempt at telling them what was going on, he realized that would not be enough. In the great scale of things, while Maximoff might not be all that young, she was immature as all fuck. Her dearest friends were Tony's just barely 7-year-old kids and a 1-year-old android. If he wanted to be on the safe side, he'd have to treat her as though she were about that mature. Less, because Tony's children, flesh or android, were more perceptive than most adults. And so, even with dozens of other things he had to attend to, he forced himself to take a breath and glance at the nearest camera on his private jet. "I need to talk to Maximoff," he told Friday. "Sure, boss," Friday said, and then she was playing the obnoxious beeping sound Tony still couldn't figure out where she picked up. "Mr. Stock?" Girl Maximoff said, looking at the camera with what looked like honest confusion. "What's going on? What?" Tony opened his mouth, then snapped it back shut. He couldn't spell out everything that was going on right now, not with how loyal Maximoff was to Rogers. He cringed at himself internally at that thought alone. He felt like an asshole for even considering concealing anything, but he needed Maximoff to stay put! He couldn't afford her messing up the politics, and he definitely didn't want to have to do with his kids if she got herself locked up in some Nigerian jail. So her safe and put had to be the ultimate goal. He could apologize later. "The Nigerians are pissed off," he said at last. "They are calling for your blood, and my lawyers need time to work their magic. You are on shaky ground with the strings I pulled to get your visa and what just happened, so please listen. I'm in a hurry, and I know I'm not explaining things right. Vision might be able to clear some things up, but whatever happens, I need you to stay put. You understand?" For long, frightening moments, she just stared at him, strangely assessing. Tony knew their understanding was basically a weak one based on her love for his kids and her trust that he wouldn't knowingly do anything to harm metahumans or the enhanced because of the Maria factor, but please, for the love of God, he couldn't have her showing up and messing this... "Okay, Mr. Stock," she said at last. Tony barely contained the way his eyes wanted to widen from pure shock. "Okay," he all but squeaked. She nodded decisively, even as he could see the fear and indecision in her eyes. "Keep the kids safe," she said, "and I'll trust you." Tony let out a breath of relief, deliberately let her hear it. "Thank you, Wanda. You don't know what that means to me." He paused for a moment, and if this were almost anyone else, he might not have been willing to verbalize this, but he did recognize the need for give and take in a relationship that had started out as fraught as theirs. "You don't know what this might mean for Maria's future." She gave a small smile, reassuring enough for him to end the call, and then the plane was touching down in Vienna. Before, quite frankly, he'd even had time to reorient himself from the utter arrogance and complete lack of understanding of the world Rogers displayed like it was nothing. He found himself face to face with the Winter Soldier, and that guy was definitely a gun again. Problem was, Tony had absolutely no idea whose finger was on the trigger. The watch gauntlet worked, at least enough to keep Tony alive, but that did not mean he liked being shot at. He gave the best he got, and the fucking asshole still got the fuck away. His adrenaline was still up, his blood still pounding, and his hand throbbing like a bitch from the kickback of the bullet when Ross informed him he'd be issuing another shoot-on-sight order. There was a part of Tony, quite frankly, a nasty, vicious part, that just wanted him to do it and actually kind of believed the world might be a better place without Rogers and Wilson and the reactivated Barnes. But even over the seductiveness of that quiet, whispering voice, Tony heard himself begging and pleading. He mentally cursed Rogers out for leaving himself solely under U.S. jurisdiction, and he itched to repulse the crap out of whoever had truly blown up the UN meeting before the Accords could be ratified, sticking Tony with Ross by extension. Even so, he made the promises he had to, said the things he needed to. He got 36 hours. "The Spiderlings watching over the kids?" Tony asked Bruce as they all stepped off the Quinjet, mostly just to reassure himself. Bruce nodded decisively. "And one is not going to show up and make everything suck," Tony continued, glancing at the Vision this time. "I believe Wanda understands at least the basics of why we do as we must, as well as why she must remain in the compound," Vision replied. Tony let his shoulders drop, sucked in a sharp breath, and steeled himself for the fight to come.